I didn't cry when my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "Pack your things and get out. I'd rather sleep in the mud than share a roof with a cheap old woman like you." I didn't shout when my own son stood there, silent while men carried my grandmother's dining table through the door I'd paid for. I only reached for my coat, closed my hand around a name I hadn't dialed in 15 years, and told myself, if the storm took everything, it also washed the truth clean. The storm had started with water. 3 feet of brown, impatient water that swallowed the lower part of town and spit out families on porches with their lives stacked in damp cardboard. When Ross called that Tuesday at 9:10 a.m., his voice tightened by panic, he said, "Mom, our apartment is flooded. Juniper's pregnant and we have nowhere to go. Could we stay with you for a few weeks?" There wasn't a question in it. There didn't need to be. "Of course," I said, and that single word became an oath I carried like a candle through dark hallways. I stripped the master bed, folded fresh linens for the guest room, stocked the refrigerator with almond milk and the exact brand of granola she liked, and drove to the pharmacy for prenatal vitamins I paid for without thinking twice. They arrived Wednesday at 7:40 p.m., a silver car gliding into my driveway like a visiting dignitary. Juniper put one hand on her barely showing belly and another on my sofa as if testing the upholstery for obedience. "I can't eat that," she said when the pot roast reached the table, wrinkling her nose like the steam offended her. "Ross, order me something from that vegan place downtown." I told myself, pregnancy is a fierce tide, that it pulls and tears and makes saints out of sinners and sinners out of saints. For 3 weeks, I told myself this as the water pressure became an issue. Then the thread count. Then the coffee maker, which she threw away because it was cheap and toxic. Words that felt less like a product review and more like a diagnosis meant for me. When she began moving the furniture, my furniture, I called it nesting and swallowed every objection like a hot coal. But the day I pulled into the driveway at 4 p.m. and saw 2 strangers lifting my grandmother's dining table into a truck, something in me grew very still. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my hands from shaking by sheer force of will. "What are you doing with that table?" One of the men glanced toward the house. Lady inside said she was selling it. Inside, Juniper stood at the center of my living room like a conductor, guiding the packing of my mother's china with brisk, efficient flicks of her fingers. "I'm decluttering," she said, not bothering to look up from her phone. "We need room for the baby." I told her, in a voice so calm it surprised me, that the table was my grandmother's, the plates, my mother's, and she finally met my eyes with something colder than disdain. "It's not really your furniture anymore, is it? Ross and I live here now. We're the ones paying the bills." I called for my son. He came from the kitchen with a sandwich, took a bite before he spoke, and said, "Mom, we talked about modernizing." The word landed like a verdict. Modernizing meant erasing. Modernizing meant history had expired. When the mover asked if they should take the rest, Juniper smiled and said, "All of it." Like generosity turned inside out. "Stop," I said, and the room actually paused. "Stop," I said again, and Juniper's smile trembled. She looked at Ross with a practiced urgency that had already learned his weak places. "Tell your mother to mind her business." The weak places failed him. "Mom," he said, "please don't make a scene." "I didn't make a scene. I made a choice." "Get out," I told them, quiet as the moment before glass breaks. Juniper laughed, sharp as a knife. "You can pack your things and disappear," she said, the venom of it almost elegant. "I'd rather sleep in the mud than share a roof with a cheap, bitter old woman like you." Ross said nothing. Silence is a kind of signature. His was neat and careful and devastating. I took my purse from the closet, put on my coat, and told the movers they could finish what they'd started, but nothing in the master bedroom was to be touched. On the threshold, I turned to Juniper and said, "Enjoy the house. I hope it brings you everything you deserve." At 6:20 p.m., In the parking lot of the downtown Marriott, I sat with my hands locked on the wheel until the shaking passed. Then I pulled an old card from a wallet pocket I never used. Marcus Webb, attorney at law. When his secretary answered, I spoke a sentence I had rehearsed only in the darkest corners of my mind. "It's time, Marcus." Marcus hadn't changed much, only the silver at his temples and a gravity in his eyes I remembered from hospital corridors and probate hearings. At 9 a.m., I sat across from the same mahogany desk where, 15 years ago, he'd slid documents toward me with the gentleness of a pastor offering a psalm. "Marlene," he said now, steepling his fingers as the blinds cut the morning light into precise white ladders across his files. "I wondered when you'd call. How long since Dorothy passed?" 15 years next month," I answered, touching the locket at my throat the way I once touched a feverish child's brow. I honored her wishes. I hoped I'd never have to use them. He opened a folder as thick as a winter Bible. "You were given power, not to punish, but to protect. Tell me what happened." I told him everything. The pot roast and the curled lip, the coffee maker tossed like trash, the dining table lifted by strangers at 4 p.m., the sentence that split my life into before and after. He listened like lawyers do when they remember they are first humans. His pen moved, but his gaze stayed with me. By 10:30 a.m., after signatures bled into witnessing and witnessing into notarizing, the bones of the past stood clean in the light. Dorothy, who balanced books for 3 companies and saved every quiet dollar, had purchased the house through a family trust, $89,000 paid with a calm foresight only grandmothers and sailors possess. She'd set terms as crisp as starched linens. Ross would always have a home, so long as he remembered what family meant. If he forgot, the administrator could reclaim the property to protect the one person who never had the luxury of forgetting. "You are the administrator," Marcus said, tapping my name where Dorothy's careful handwriting once lived, "and you have been more patient than most saints." I didn't feel holy. I felt tired and very awake. That afternoon, I drove past the house I no longer entered. Through the broad front windows, I watched Juniper choreograph a florist's crew, like a queen directing a coronation. The walls, once butter-warm, were turning fashionable gray. My roses had been ripped out for a landscape of gravel and angles, designed for photographs instead of seasons. At 6:50 p.m., my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, texted to say Juniper was telling everyone I'd signed the house over as an early inheritance, that I was happier in a retirement home where, and here the message tightened my throat, I had people my own age. I thanked her and wrote, "Everything will be sorted soon," which felt like telling a child the thunder can't come into the bedroom. On Thursday at 11:15 a.m., the bank called. The polite voice explained that someone had attempted to open a line of credit secured by my property. "A Mrs. Juniper Patterson," the woman said, careful as if the name might burn. "But our records show the home is held in trust, with you as the sole beneficiary and trustee." I asked for a fraud alert and copies of whatever she'd waved like a magic wand. The banker cleared her throat. She was upset when we asked for documentation. I imagined the brittle smile cracking, the certainty faltering where it always does, against fact. Friday at 7:10 p.m., I parked in my own driveway as if it belonged to a stranger and rang my own bell. Juniper opened the door, color draining like a tide-leaving rock. "What are you doing here?" she asked, and I smiled with the kind of calm Dorothy saved for emergencies and pies. "I've come for a few personal things. I hope that's not a problem." Ross drifted into view, his hair raked by restless fingers, a boy's tell on a man's face. "Mom, you can't just show up," he tried, and I stepped past them into a living room that looked like a furniture catalog had chewed it and spit out the flavor. "Interesting," I said, letting my gaze touch every new angle. "I had a call from the bank." Juniper's voice pitched up on false innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about." I turned to her with the pleasant smile I had worn like armor for months. "My dear, you have no idea how dramatic I can be." I walked to the mantel where Dorothy's portrait should have been and found an expensive abstraction pretending to be meaning. "Tell me, Ross, do you remember your grandmother's last words? That you'd always be taken care of?" He blinked, unsure which memory would save him. "She wanted me to be happy," he offered, and I reached into my purse and drew out a crisp copy of the thing that would finally teach him the difference between happiness and ease. Juniper lunged, quicker than her delicate manner ever suggested, but I held the paper high. "What does it say?" Ross whispered, and I felt something inside me loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the courage of release. "Sit down," I told them, soft as prayer and sharp as judgment. "It's time you learned the truth about this house and about Dorothy." Ross sat first because that was what he'd always done, obeyed whichever voice sounded most certain. Juniper remained standing, her arms folded tight against her body like a fortress of silk and pride. I laid the document across my lap, tracing the embossed seal that had waited 15 years for this moment. "The Dorothy May Patterson Family Trust," I said quietly. "Established October 15, 1987. Primary asset, the property located at 428 Maple Street." Juniper scoffed. "You're joking. Ross inherited this house when his father died." "He inherited the debt," I said, lifting my eyes to hers. "The house was never his to inherit. Dorothy bought it 6 months before your father packed his bags and disappeared." Ross frowned, as if trying to solve a riddle too cruel to be clever. "But I've been paying taxes, insurance, maintenance, everything. I have proof." "You have proof of responsibility," I said, "not ownership. There's a difference, and Dorothy understood it better than anyone." For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of Juniper's breathing, fast and sharp. "So what are you saying?" she demanded. "That all this time we've been living here illegally?" "No," I said. "You were living here on grace. My grace and Dorothy's foresight." She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. "The trust grants Ross full use of this home as long as he fulfills one condition, that he provide care and support for his mother until her death or until she willingly gives up that right." Juniper blinked, then laughed, the sound brittle as glass underfoot. "That's ridiculous. You can't force someone to be nice to their mother." "Kindness can't be legislated," I said, "but cruelty has consequences." Ross shifted, his face pale as milk. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, standing slowly, "that when your wife told me to pack my things and disappear, and when you stood there and said nothing, you violated the terms of the trust." The color drained from his face, the way color drains from photographs left too long in the sun. "You're saying I could lose the house?" "I'm saying you already have," I answered. Juniper's mask slipped, fury lighting her face. "This is extortion. You've been waiting for this, haven't you? To punish us." "No," I said, feeling my voice steady into something larger than anger. "I've been waiting for you to remember who you are. But since you can't, Dorothy will remind you." I left them in silence, the trust folded neatly in my hand like a verdict, and called Marcus as I reached my car. He answered on the first ring. "I take it they know." "They know," I said. "She'll scream fraud." "She already did," he said dryly. "My secretary's still recovering. I invited them to meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. to review the documentation. I suggested they bring counsel." I smiled faintly, imagining Juniper's manicured fingers trembling over her phone as she searched for a lawyer who couldn't save her. "Thank you, Marcus." "Marlene," he said after a pause, "are you sure about this? Once you invoke your authority, there's no undoing it. I looked up at the windows of my house, and saw two shadows moving behind the glass, arguing. Yes, I said, I'm sure. When morning came, I dressed with the precision of ritual. Navy suit, pearl necklace, hair pinned in the way Dorothy once said made me look formidable enough to fight God. At 9:45 a.m., I sat in Marcus's office, the smell of coffee and polished wood thick in the air. At 10:10, I heard Juniper before I saw her, her voice sharp, slicing the hallway. "This is fraud, Ross. They're trying to steal from us." They entered like a storm, and when she saw me, her face twisted with shock that I was not gone, not broken. "What is she doing here?" she spat. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said evenly, "is the trust administrator. She has every right to be present." Ross looked smaller somehow, his hair uncombed, his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. Juniper dropped into her chair like a queen dragged into court. "We want to know how to break this trust," she said. Marcus lifted a folder. "You can't. Ross never had an inheritance to lose." He slid a copy of the deed across the desk. "The property was purchased by Dorothy's trust. Your father never owned it." Juniper snatched it up, eyes darting over the lines, searching for a loophole she could squeeze through. "Where did she get $89,000? She was just some old woman." I almost smiled. "Some old woman who worked 3 jobs and saved every cent. She was wiser than both of you put together." Marcus opened another file. "Hospital records, October 1987. Dorothy Patterson, emergency surgery to remove a brain tumor. She recovered but knew she might not survive. That's when she established the trust." The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to be cruel. Ross swallowed hard. "She had a brain tumor?" "Benign," I said softly. "But she wanted to make sure you were protected from becoming your father." Juniper slammed the file shut. "This is insane. You're making him feel guilty for something his father did." "No," I said. "I'm showing him what his grandmother did to make sure he never became that man." Ross's voice trembled. "Mom, what happens now?" I looked at him, the boy I'd carried through fevers and heartbreak, and said, "Now, you face the consequences of forgetting where you came from." The words settled between us like the first crack of thunder before a long-awaited storm. Marcus adjusted his glasses, his tone calm but weighted. "Mr. Patterson, according to the trust, your right to remain in the property depended entirely on fulfilling your obligation to care for your mother. When you failed to do so, when you allowed her to be ejected from her own home, that right was revoked." The words struck the room like a hammer. Ross gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles whitening. "So you're saying I have no legal claim to the house at all?" "That's correct," Marcus said. "The trust administrator, your mother, has already invoked her rights to reclaim it." Juniper stood so abruptly that her chair screeched against the floor. "This is absurd. You can't just take our home because of some dusty piece of paper from the 80s. "Actually," Marcus replied evenly, "that's exactly what the law allows." Ross turned to me, his eyes wet with disbelief. "Mom, please. She's pregnant. We have nowhere to go." "You had a home," I said softly. "You chose to make it someone else's." Juniper's voice cut through mine, desperate now. "You're doing this to punish me. Admit it. You've been waiting for a reason to make Ross choose between us." I met her eyes, calm and deliberate. "No. I'm giving him the choice he should have made a long time ago." Marcus opened another folder. "The trust contains a resolution clause," he said, flipping to the marked page. "If Ross can demonstrate that he's committed to fulfilling his obligations, and if Mrs. Patterson agrees to reinstate him, control of the property can be restored." Ross's gaze flickered with hope. "What do I have to do?" "That," I said, "depends on what your marriage means to you." The silence grew taut. Juniper crossed her arms. "What does our marriage have to do with anything?" Marcus answered for me. "Dorothy included a special clause for what she called toxic influences. If a spouse manipulates or coerces the beneficiary into abandoning family obligations, the trust forces a choice. Honor your commitment to family or forfeit your inheritance permanently." Juniper laughed, but it was hollow. "You can't be serious. A dead woman can't decide who my husband keeps in his life." "She's not deciding," I said quietly. "She's protecting what she built." Ross buried his face in his hands. "Mom, what exactly are you asking me to do?" I looked at him. The boy who once brought me dandelions, now a man who'd let me be erased from my own life. "I'm asking you to choose. Between the woman who raised you and the woman who told you to throw me away." Juniper's chair scraped again as she stood. "You're cruel, forcing him to choose between his mother and his pregnant wife. What kind of monster does that?" "The kind who has nothing left to lose," I said, my voice steady. "The kind who finally understands that love means nothing without respect." Ross's voice cracked. "There has to be another way." Marcus sighed and turned the document so they could see. "The clause is explicit. If the spouse shows hostility, verbal abuse, financial manipulation, or attempts to exclude the administrator from family decisions, the administrator may revoke all benefits." Juniper went pale. "Hostility? I was under stress. I said things I didn't mean." Ross's tone hardened for the first time. "Did you or did you not sell my grandmother's dining set?" She blinked, caught off guard. "I was decluttering, making space for the baby." "Did you or did you not try to take out a loan using the house as collateral?" Silence. Her lips parted, then closed again. He turned toward me, eyes wide with something new, realization. "You knew all along, didn't you? About the trust?" "Yes," I said simply, "and you let me think it was mine." "You were fulfilling your duty," I replied. "Dorothy wanted you to learn the value of care, not ownership." He looked away, his voice a whisper. "So all these years you were testing me?" "No," I said softly. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to." Juniper's control finally cracked. "You manipulative old witch," she hissed. "You've ruined everything. Ross, tell her she can't do this. Tell her she's lost her mind." But Ross didn't speak. He was staring at the trust document like it was a mirror showing him a stranger's reflection. I saw it then. The moment he realized he'd become his father. I stood, smoothing my skirt. "This isn't about revenge, Ross. It's about remembrance. Dorothy gave you every chance to be the man she believed you could become. You chose to forget." Juniper slammed her hand against the desk. "You're finished, both of you. I'll find a lawyer. "You should," Marcus interrupted gently. "But before you do, Mrs. Patterson would like me to read one final provision." I nodded, watching Juniper's fury settle into stillness, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. "Go ahead," I said. Marcus read slowly. "In the event that the beneficiary's spouse demonstrates a willingness to use children as weapons against family members, the administrator may permanently revoke all rights to the trust, without possibility of restoration." Juniper blinked. "What does that mean?" I met her eyes. "It means, my dear, that when you threatened to keep my grandchild from me, you ended this story yourself." The words hung heavy in the air. Ross looked at me, devastated. "Mom, please, don't do this." "It's already done," I said. 30 days. Then you leave my house." Juniper's voice broke on a whisper. "You'll regret this." "No," I said, walking to the door. "For the first time in years, I won't." Outside, the autumn wind carried the sharp scent of rain. I breathed in deeply, the air cold and clean. Behind me, I could still hear Juniper's voice rising, shrill and desperate, but I didn't turn back. Some storms, I thought, are meant to wash the world clean, and mine had just begun. 6 weeks later, the house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that hums with peace instead of tension. The walls no longer echoed with Juniper's complaints or Ross's apologies. The furniture had been returned to its rightful places, each item polished like a memory restored. I stood in the kitchen at 3:30 p.m., rolling out pie dough the way Dorothy had taught me. No recipe, just instinct. The smell of apples and cinnamon filled the air, and for the first time in months, it felt like home again. My home. The dining table Juniper tried to sell sat back where it belonged, its wood glinting under the soft light from the window. I'd tracked it down at a consignment shop 2 towns over and bought it back without hesitation. The woman at the store had said, "It's a beautiful set." The previous seller didn't know what she had. Oh, I thought she knew. She just didn't understand it. I'd spent the past month undoing her touch. The sterile gray walls were warm again, the garden replanted with Dorothy's roses, and the guest room transformed into a small library filled with books and photographs of 3 generations of women who'd refused to be erased. The phone rang. Ross. I hesitated before answering. "Hello, Ross." His voice was quieter now, more careful, as though he'd finally learned that words carry weight. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" "I'm well," I said, dusting flour from my hands. "And you?" "We're managing." He paused. "Juniper had the baby last week." My hand stilled over the counter. Despite everything, the thought of my grandchild pulled something deep inside me. "Is everyone healthy?" "Yes. It's a boy. We named him Daniel, after Dad." The irony was almost poetic. I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "I'm glad they're both well." There was a silence on the line, fragile but not empty. "Mom, I need to say something," he began. "I've been thinking about what happened, about what you said that day in Marcus's office." His voice cracked, small and trembling. "You were right. I let her talk to you like that. I let her sell your things, lie to you, humiliate you. I didn't stop her. I just kept trying to keep the peace, and I lost everything because of it." "Yes," I said simply. The word landed between us without cruelty, only truth. He took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." I leaned against the counter, watching the late sun spill gold over the floor. Apologies don't fix everything, Ross, but they can start something new. He was quiet for a long time before saying, "We're separated. She left 3 weeks ago, took the baby to Phoenix to stay with her sister. I'm working 2 jobs just to afford the apartment and child support." I closed my eyes, picturing him in some small, bare apartment. The boy who once had a home handed to him, now learning what it meant to earn one. "I'm sorry you're in pain," I said, and I meant it, "but I'm not sorry you learned. Some lessons only come the hard way." "I think I finally understand," he whispered, "what Grandma wanted, what you were trying to do. She wasn't protecting me from losing things. She was protecting me from becoming someone who didn't deserve them." The words softened something in me I hadn't realized was still clenched. "What will you do now?" I asked. "I'm thinking about going back to school, maybe getting that engineering degree I always talked about. Daniel will need a future, and I want to be the kind of father Grandma would have been proud of." For the first time, I heard pride in his voice. Not the easy kind built on inheritance, but the kind carved from humility. "It sounds like a good plan," I said. He hesitated again. "Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask, but could I see you sometime? I want Daniel to know his grandmother." I looked around the house, at the portrait of Dorothy smiling down from the mantel. "That could be arranged," I said, "but with conditions." "Of course," he said quickly. "You come alone, at least for now," I told him. "No one who hasn't earned the right to be in this house steps inside it. And you understand. This is my sanctuary, not yours." "I understand," he said quietly. "And Mom, thank you for not giving up on me." When I hung up, the house felt warmer somehow. Outside, the roses trembled in the breeze, their petals catching the last light of day. Maybe Dorothy had been right all along. Sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them fall far enough to find their own way back. 3 days later, at exactly 2 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Ross stood there, thinner, older, but steadier. He held a small gift bag. "I brought something," he said. Inside was a framed photo of baby Daniel and a note, "For the grandmother who deserves to watch him grow up. Love, Ross and Daniel." I felt tears sting my eyes, but I smiled through them. "He's beautiful," I whispered. "He has your eyes." "And yours," Ross said softly. We sat in the living room, the same one that had once been a battlefield, and talked until the sunlight turned honey gold. He told me about night classes, his new job at the hardware store, how hard it was to learn to cook for himself. "I never realized how much you did for me," he said. "You weren't supposed to," I replied gently. That was the point. As evening settled, he stood to leave. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking just slightly, "I don't expect you to forgive me. Not yet, but I'm going to keep showing up until you believe I mean it." I walked him to the door and nodded. "Then I'll see you next week," I said. After he left, I poured tea and cut a slice of Dorothy's apple pie, its crust golden and perfect. I sat in the chair by the window as the sky blushed pink over the garden she'd planted 40 years ago. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval or apology. I was home, truly home. And I finally understood what Dorothy meant when she whispered her last words to me. Take care of him, but never forget to take care of yourself. Some storms destroy, but some wash the world clean. Mine had done both and left behind something stronger. A woman who remembered her worth. If you stayed with me until the end, tell me, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to choose peace over family? Comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that even broken things can bloom again.